What if everything you thought you knew about a sitting member of Congress was a lie? In a moment, you'll see Senator Ted Cruz confront Representative Ilhan Omar with documents so explosive she froze on hearing. He asked a single question she couldn't answer, and that moment changed everything. But here's the thing. That question was just the beginning. Because as the hearing went on, Cruz pulled back layer after layer, revealing evidence that shook the room to its core. Immigration fraud, corruption, even allegations of treason. And the truth? You won't believe how far it went, or how it ended, until you've seen it unfold for yourself. Before we dive in, drop a comment where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you never miss this moments. Today was the day Cruz promised to reveal what he called a betrayal hidden in plain sight. The nation had been buzzing for weeks. Rumors swirled, headlines screamed speculation, but no one knew for sure what Cruz had in his folder, the one now resting beneath his fingertips. Across from him sat Representative Ilhan Omar, her expression calm, almost unreadable, though the faint tightening around her jaw betrayed the weight of the moment. Cruz began slowly, his voice measured, deliberate, every word calculated to hold the room. "Representative Omar," he said, "you've presented yourself to the American people as a refugee who fled hardship, who sought freedom, who built a new life under the protection of this Constitution. But today, we will examine whether that story holds under scrutiny, or whether it crumbles under the truth." The gallery stirred. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned in. This was the opening they had been waiting for. Cruz raised the first document, holding it high enough for the cameras to catch. "This," he continued, "is your initial immigration file, and within it, there are details, critical details, that conflict with what you've told the American public for years." Omar's eyes flickered briefly, but she remained silent, hands folded neatly in front of her. The senator paused, allowing the tension to stretch just enough. He wanted the viewers at home to feel the unease, to lean closer to their screens, to wonder what revelation was about to unfold. Then he leaned in further. "Before we go any deeper," Cruz said, his tone suddenly sharper, "I want every American watching to understand one thing. What we are about to reveal will not just answer questions. It will shake the very foundation of trust we place in those elected to serve us. Stay with me until the end, because the truth is larger than one person. It reaches far beyond this room." The chamber hushed again, every ear tuned to the next words. The stage was set. The first crack in the narrative had been struck, and the promise of more to come hung heavy in the air. The silence in the chamber was suffocating. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than usual. Cruz didn't rush. He wanted the weight of his opening to settle before he struck again. Slowly, he slid the document across the polished desk toward the clerk, who handed it down the line until it reached Omar. "Representative Omar," Cruz said, his voice sharp now, cutting through the hush, "can you explain why your immigration records list your marital status as married, yet at the very same time, another file, one you signed, identifies you as unmarried?" The words hung in the air. For the first time, Omar shifted slightly in her chair, a near imperceptible movement, but one that the cameras caught instantly. The reporters scribbled furiously. This was no ordinary discrepancy. Cruz leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Two files. Two conflicting stories. One truth. Which one belongs to you?" Omar lifted her chin. "Senator, my past is complicated. Many refugees endure difficulties that—" "Complicated?" Cruz interrupted, his tone sharp enough to draw a collective gasp from the room. "With respect, Representative, complications do not explain signing government documents under penalty of perjury. This isn't about hardship. This is about honesty." The tension ratcheted higher. Cruz knew he had struck a nerve. He pressed forward, relentless. "If one record is accurate, then the other must be false. And a false record in immigration law has a name: fraud." Omar drew in a breath, steadying herself. "Senator, you're twisting my history for political gain." "Political gain?" Cruz shot back, his hand slamming against the desk. "This is not about politics. This is about the oath you swore when you stepped into this chamber. An oath to serve the American people with integrity, and today, the integrity of that oath is under question." The room buzzed with whispers. Journalists exchanged wide-eyed glances. Television producers in the back whispered into headsets, cueing dramatic close-ups. Every second was fuel for the story that would dominate the evening news. Cruz, sensing the rising energy, didn't give Omar room to recover. "I will ask you again, Representative Omar. Married or unmarried? Which of these statements is a lie? Omar's lips parted as if to answer, but no words came. The pause, just a heartbeat too long, was enough. Cruz leaned in, his voice dropping lower, but carrying all the more power for it. The American people deserve clarity, and silence, he said, is an answer in itself. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Omar's silence wasn't just a pause now, it was an image, one that would replay endlessly on screens across the country. A congresswoman frozen by a single question, and Cruz knew it. He sat back slowly, satisfied. The hearing had only just begun, yet the opening blow had already landed. Cruz adjusted his microphone and signaled to the clerk. A thick stack of folders was carried forward and placed squarely in front of him. The pile itself was theatrical, meant to show weight, meant to show that this wasn't rumor or hearsay, but paper, signatures, and dates. Ladies and gentlemen, Cruz began, sweeping a hand over the documents. These are not speculations. These are certified government records, and they tell a story, one far different from the one we've been told for years. He lifted the top folder, opening it deliberately. The cameras zoomed in, catching the crisp black ink of government seals. Cruz read aloud. Application for permanent residency, dated 1995. Applicant, Ilhan Abdullahi Omar. Marital status, married. He set it down, then pulled another. Renewal form, dated the very same year. Marital status, single. He looked up, letting the words sink in. 2 filings. Same year, same applicant. Different truths. The audience stirred. The contradiction was plain, undeniable even to those unfamiliar with legal jargon. Cruz pressed on. When we talk about fraud, we are not talking about vague accusations. We are talking about sworn statements. Statements that can determine who enters this country, who gains protection, who has the privilege of citizenship. Omar shifted again, her composure steady, but her silence still striking. Cruz tapped the folders. Representative Omar, you have built your public image on resilience, on struggle, on triumph. But resilience does not excuse deception, and struggle does not justify falsehoods. He motioned to the clerk again. A screen flickered to life behind him, projecting scanned copies of the documents for the audience and press gallery. 2 forms appeared side by side, each bearing Omar's signature. Married? Single. The murmurs grew louder, reporters leaning so far forward they nearly toppled their chairs. Cruz let the images linger before speaking again. This is not an isolated error. This is not clerical oversight. This is pattern, a pattern that will become clearer as we proceed. He closed the folder slowly, with the deliberateness of a judge delivering a sentence. And it does not end here. These records are only the beginning. There are witnesses, officials who handled these very files, who will speak to what they saw, what they were told, and how these inconsistencies slipped through. He paused, leaning closer into the microphone. His tone dropped, almost conspiratorial, drawing the viewers at home deeper into the unfolding drama. If you think this is the worst of it, you are mistaken, because the documents lead us to something far more serious than false boxes checked on an immigration form. They lead us to questions of loyalty, questions of betrayal. The chamber erupted into noise, half gasps, half whispers. Cruz raised his hand, calling for order. "We will hear from the first witness," he declared. At that, the doors opened and a man in a navy suit stepped forward, carrying himself with the weary seriousness of someone who had spent a lifetime in government service. The hearing was about to enter its next phase. The clerk announced his name, and the man took the stand. He placed his right hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and lowered himself into the chair with deliberate care. His face bore the calm of someone who had carried heavy truths for too long. Cruz leaned forward. "Please state your name and your former position for the record." "My name is Daniel Whitaker," the man said, voice steady. "I served as a senior officer with the Immigration and Naturalization Service from 1989 until the department transitioned into Homeland Security." Cruz nodded. "Mr. Whitaker, during your tenure, did you oversee or review the immigration application of Representative Ilhan Omar?" Whitaker glanced at the stack of documents before him. "Yes, Senator. I personally reviewed elements of her file. It stood out because of the irregularities. 2 conflicting entries filed within months of each other." Cruz tapped his pen against the desk. "And in your professional assessment, what do such discrepancies suggest?" Whitaker's eyes shifted briefly toward Omar, then back to Cruz. "At best, negligence. At worst, intentional misrepresentation. The form that listed her as married raised immediate red flags, because records in another department suggested the marriage was not only recent, but also potentially fraudulent, designed to exploit a loophole. The chamber filled with murmurs. Cruz pressed further. "Fraudulent marriage? Explain for the record." Whitaker folded his hands. "At that time, Senator, we often encountered cases where individuals would claim spousal status to gain immigration benefits, while in reality, the relationship existed only on paper. In Representative Omar's case, the timeline did not add up, and the supposed spouse listed had already filed paperwork connected to another family unit." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Cameras zoomed in on Omar, her face impassive but her silence again screaming louder than words. Cruz didn't let up. "Mr. Whitaker, did you raise these concerns?" "I did," Whitaker replied, "but the case moved forward regardless. Higher offices pushed it through. These things happen more often than the public realizes." Cruz leaned back, his tone sharpening with each word. "So, you're telling this chamber that Representative Omar's path to citizenship may have been built on fraudulent filings, and those filings were ignored, not corrected?" Whitaker nodded once. "That is correct." The audience erupted, voices clashing between outrage and disbelief. The chairman banged the gavel for silence, but the uproar underscored the weight of what had just been said. Cruz let the noise linger before speaking again, low and deliberate. "Mr. Whitaker, you've just confirmed under oath that the integrity of our immigration system was bypassed, and that Representative Omar's very presence in this chamber may rest on a foundation of deception." Whitaker's voice was quiet but resolute. "That is my testimony, Senator." Cruz turned his gaze back to Omar, holding the silence as though daring her to break it. She did not. The hearing had shifted. No longer was this just about forms. It was about a system bent under pressure and the question of whether one of its beneficiaries had knowingly exploited it. Cruz shuffled the stack of folders once more, but this time he didn't reach for immigration forms. Instead, he pulled out a slim binder, its cover stamped with the seal of the Federal Election Commission. The gallery hushed again. Everyone knew where this was heading. "Mr. Chairman," Cruz said, his voice steady, "what we have discussed so far deals with the foundation of Representative Omar's entry into this country, but fraud has a way of leaving fingerprints long after the first crime. Today, I will show how those fingerprints extend into the halls of Congress itself." He opened the binder and read aloud. "Federal Election Commission Audit, Case File 17223. Records show payments authorized by Representative Omar's campaign committee, payments that, on the surface, appear ordinary, consulting fees, travel reimbursements, logistical costs, but, when cross-referenced with banking records, those payments lead not to legitimate vendors, but to accounts tied directly to her personal circle." A ripple moved across the chamber like a wave. Cruz tapped the page with his finger. "Funds meant to serve her constituents, redirected for personal benefit, flights for family members, lodging at luxury hotels, transfers into private accounts that have nothing to do with campaigning." Omar finally broke her silence. "That is a gross misrepresentation. These expenses were reviewed and cleared according to procedure." Cruz shot back instantly. "Reviewed? Or concealed? The American people are not here for rehearsed denials. They are here for truth, and truth does not hide behind redacted lines and vague accounting entries." He held up a photocopy, displaying it for the cameras. "Here, a transfer of $12,000 labeled consulting. The recipient? A company controlled by your then-husband. Another entry, $8,500 in travel reimbursement. The destination? A resort, not a campaign stop." The gallery erupted, flashes from cameras flickering like lightning. Cruz leaned closer into the microphone, his tone grave. "When we talk about corruption, people think of backroom deals and secret bribes. But sometimes corruption hides in plain sight, disguised as ordinary paperwork. What we have here is not clerical error. It is betrayal of trust, signed and authorized by a sitting member of Congress." Omar gripped the edge of the desk, her voice raised now, sharp with defiance. "This is a political witch hunt, Senator. You're twisting data to fit your narrative because you fear voices like mine in this chamber." Cruz's reply came like a hammer. "If you fear questions, Representative, perhaps it is because the answers are damning. The truth does not tremble when challenged, only lies do." The gavel struck again as the chairman called for order, but the damage was done. Cruz had turned numbers into narrative, transforming dry accounting lines into a story of corruption. He closed the binder with finality. "We will now introduce testimony from someone who can speak directly to the handling of these funds." At that, another witness rose from the side chamber, a former campaign staffer, eyes downcast, carrying the weight of a story they could no longer keep hidden. The fire was only beginning to spread. The former staffer adjusted the microphone with trembling hands. His name was Matthew Klein, a mid-level campaign aide who had worked closely with Omar's finance team during her last re-election bid. His demeanor was cautious, but his presence alone electrified the room. Cruz began gently, almost invitingly. "Mr. Klein, thank you for appearing today. Could you tell the chamber what your role was within Representative Omar's campaign?" Klein cleared his throat. "I handled logistics and financial reporting. That included reviewing receipts, processing reimbursements, and filing monthly disclosures with the FEC." Cruz nodded. "So, you were in a position to see how funds were spent?" "Yes, Senator," Klein replied, his voice steadier now. "I was in the middle of it." Cruz leaned in. "Did you observe anything irregular in how those funds were handled?" Klein hesitated, then spoke with a tone that betrayed both fear and relief. "Yes, many expenses were deliberately mislabeled. Payments listed as consulting fees often went to close relatives. Travel reimbursements included personal vacations. There were even cash withdrawals I was told not to question." The room stirred violently, gasps echoing as if a thunderclap had struck inside the chamber. Cruz allowed the noise to swell before pressing further. "Were you instructed to conceal these transactions?" "Yes," Klein admitted. "When I asked questions, I was told, keep it clean for the filings, but don't worry about where the money ends up. If I pressed too hard, I was cut out of the loop." Cruz's eyes narrowed. "And who gave those instructions?" Klein's voice dropped, but the microphone carried it clearly. "Representative Omar herself. Sometimes directly, sometimes through her senior advisors. But the orders were clear. Make the paperwork look legitimate, no matter what the reality was." The gallery erupted again, reporters nearly climbing over one another to get the words down. Omar slammed her hand against the desk. "This is outrageous. This man is a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. He was let go for incompetence, and now he invents stories to smear me." Klein turned toward her, his face pale but resolute. "I kept copies, Representative. Every form I filed, every altered receipt. I knew someday I might need them." The chamber went still. Cruz seized the moment. "Mr. Klein, are you saying under oath that you retained evidence of this misconduct?" "Yes, Senator. I submitted it to federal investigators weeks ago." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. For the first time, Omar's composure cracked. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes flicked toward her counsel seated behind her. Cruz sat back, his voice like steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is not rumor. It is testimony, backed by evidence from someone who worked inside Representative Omar's own campaign. This is the pattern. From fraudulent documents to corrupted funds, the deception runs deep." The gavel struck, but no sound could truly contain the weight of Klein's words. The hearing had crossed a threshold. From this point forward, it wasn't speculation. It was proof, sworn and undeniable. Cruz sat in silence for a moment after Klein's testimony, letting the gravity of it wash over the chamber. Then, with a deliberate motion, he signaled toward the double doors at the back. They opened slowly, and two men in uniform entered, decorated veterans, their presence commanding instant respect. The shuffle of the gallery subsided into absolute quiet. The first witness took the stand. He wore the insignia of a retired Army colonel, his posture rigid, his voice gravelly with years of command. "Colonel," Cruz began, "for the record, please state your name and service." "Colonel James Hartley, United States Army, retired. 24 years of service, including tours in Somalia and the Middle East." Cruz leaned in. "Colonel Hartley, you have come here today to testify about the consequences of misinformation and policy influenced by Representative Omar. Could you share your experience?" Hartley's eyes fixed on Omar, then shifted to the committee. "During my time in Somalia, we relied heavily on accurate intelligence to keep our men alive. But there were channels, funding streams, and political voices that undermined our efforts. Representative Omar's connections to organizations funneling money overseas raised red flags. Funds intended for relief often ended up in the hands of those who armed militias." The chamber bristled. Cruz pressed on. "And the impact of that?" Hartley's jaw tightened. "The impact was lives. American soldiers pinned down by weapons purchased with money that should have gone to feed children. Each misdirected dollar became a bullet, a mortar, a roadside bomb. The words landed like a hammer. The gallery gasped, some audibly cursing under their breath. Cruz allowed the silence to grow unbearable before moving to the second witness. A younger officer took the chair this time, his uniform crisp, medals shining under the lights. He introduced himself as Captain Miguel Reyes, recently retired after a tour in Afghanistan. "Captain Reyes," Cruz said, "you reviewed intelligence reports involving Representative Omar. What did you find?" Reyes spoke firmly, without hesitation. "We saw repeated patterns of advocacy that weakened our position abroad, calls to reduce oversight on certain organizations that later appeared on watch lists, pushes to cut security funding that directly affected operations. The cost was not theoretical. It was measured in American lives." Gasps echoed again. Omar leaned forward, her voice rising above the murmurs. "This is slander. You are twisting tragedies to serve your agenda. I have always stood for peace and humanitarian aid." Hartley turned toward her, his voice cutting through. "Aid doesn't buy rifles, Representative, but money channeled through the wrong hands does, and soldiers like mine paid the price." The tension was unbearable. Reporters scribbled frantically, while the live broadcast captured every glance, every pause. Cruz folded his hands, his voice slow, deliberate. "The American people need to understand. This is not merely about documents or finances. This is about consequences. Decisions made in this chamber ripple outward until they reach the battlefield. And when corruption or betrayal is allowed to stand, it is not just democracy that suffers, it is flesh and blood." The chamber was utterly still. Even Omar did not reply this time. Cruz leaned forward once more. "The question before us is no longer whether inconsistencies exist. The question is whether betrayal has been allowed to hide behind the veil of office, and we will not stop until we have the answer." The gavel struck, but the echo felt like a drumbeat leading into the final act. The weight in the chamber was crushing, every ear tuned to the smallest shuffle, every camera fixed on the witness chair. Cruz didn't move right away. He let the silence linger, because silence was more powerful than thunder when people were holding their breath. Then he reached for a final folder, a thin one, but marked with the seal of the Department of Justice. He placed it on the desk with deliberate care, his fingers pressing against the cover as though holding back the storm inside. "Representative Omar," Cruz began, his voice lower now, sharp as glass, "we have spoken of documents, of finances, of consequences abroad. But this," he tapped the folder, "this is the bridge that connects every piece together." He slid the folder to the clerk, who handed it forward. Inside was a transcript stamped "Confidential." Cruz leaned in. "This is a communication intercepted by federal investigators. It details money moving from a charitable organization you supported into accounts linked to groups on our own government's terror watch list." The chamber gasped as if struck by a single, collective blow. Cruz's voice rose, echoing in the hushed hall. "Aid. Redirected. Not to schools, not to hospitals, but to those who built weapons, who orchestrated attacks, who targeted Americans abroad." Omar shook her head sharply. "That is a fabrication. A distortion meant to destroy me. I have never—" "Never?" Cruz cut in, his tone hammering. "Then explain why your name appears in the correspondence authorizing the transfer. Explain why investigators trace the funds back to your approval." The gallery erupted, voices clashing, flashes firing. Reporters barked questions into their phones while producers whispered urgently into headsets. Omar's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the document, flipping through it quickly. Her lips moved as if forming a rebuttal, but no sound came. The silence stretched. Cruz leaned back, his gaze unflinching. "Representative Omar, this is not a witch hunt. This is not speculation. This is the chain of evidence, documents, witnesses, testimony, all converging on one undeniable conclusion, and the American people are watching." The chairman struck the gavel for order, but the noise was uncontrollable. Then Cruz spoke again, louder, commanding. "This is bigger than campaign fraud, bigger than immigration lies. This is a question of allegiance. And if what these documents reveal is true, then this is treason." The word cracked like a whip. Treason. The chamber froze. Reporters stopped mid-sentence. The word hung in the air heavier than any accusation before. Omar sat motionless, the transcript still in her hand, her silence now deafening. Cruz leaned forward one last time. "You can deny. You can remain silent. But the evidence speaks louder than either, and the American people deserve an answer." The room buzzed like a hive shaken from its sleep. The hearing had reached its breaking point. What came next would decide everything. The chairman's gavel hammered against the desk, but the chaos in the chamber refused to die down. Senators leaned in close, reporters shouted over one another, and flashes from cameras flickered like lightning in a storm. At the center of it all sat Omar, rigid, the transcript clenched tightly in her hand. Cruz waited for the noise to crest, then he rose from his seat. His voice cut through the uproar like a blade. "Order will be restored," he commanded, though his eyes never left Omar, "because what I am about to say cannot be drowned out, not by denial, not by outrage, not even by silence." The chamber quieted reluctantly, every ear tuned to his words. Cruz lifted the DOJ folder high. "This evidence does not end in debate. It demands action. And I will not sit idle while betrayal festers within these halls." He turned toward the chairman, his tone booming. "Mr. Chairman, I move that this committee formally recommend criminal investigation into Representative Ilhan Omar for fraud, corruption, and treason against the United States." The word returned, heavier than before, treason. It rippled through the chamber, freezing faces into masks of shock. Omar rose abruptly, slamming the transcript down on the table. "This is outrageous. A baseless attack meant to silence my voice and the communities I represent. You fear me, Senator Cruz, because I speak truth to power. This is nothing but theater." Cruz's reply came cold, sharp. "Theater ends when the curtain falls, Representative, but the law does not end. The truth does not end. And tonight, the American people will decide which one of us they believe." The audience erupted once more, some cheering Cruz, others shouting in Omar's defense. The chairman's gavel thundered again, demanding order, but the frenzy could not be contained. The broadcast carried every second into living rooms across the nation, families watching in stunned silence as history unfolded. Cruz pressed forward, his voice unwavering. "This nation was built on oaths sworn to protect the Constitution. Betray that oath, and you betray every soldier who bled for this country, every citizen who trusted their vote, every family who believed their leaders stood for them. If we turn a blind eye now, then the very foundation of this republic crumbles." The gavel struck once more, but Cruz ignored it. His final words thundered across the hall. "Let the people see, let them judge, and let justice take its course." For a heartbeat, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Omar stood, her face pale but defiant, locked in a silent standoff with Cruz. Neither moved, neither blinked. And then, from the side doors, uniformed officers stepped into the room. The gallery gasped, the climax cresting into chaos. The sudden appearance of uniformed officers electrified the chamber. The sound of boots on marble echoed like drumbeats, each step hammering home the gravity of the moment. Reporters gasped. Some shouted into microphones, their words scrambled by the roar of the crowd. The chairman struck his gavel desperately. "Order! Order in this chamber!" But order was gone. History was moving too fast to be contained by wood and steel. The officers stopped at the witness table. One leaned in, speaking firmly but clearly. "Representative Ilhan Omar, by order of federal authorities, you are hereby taken into custody pending investigation on charges of fraud, corruption, and treason." The words struck like a lightning bolt. Gasps turned to shouts. Omar rose, her chair scraping sharply against the floor. "This is a sham, a disgrace to democracy. I will fight this with every breath I have." Her voice was fierce, but her wrists trembled as the cuffs closed around them. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every second, every frame destined to loop across networks and social media feeds. Cruz stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the scene. He did not gloat. He did not smile. His voice, when it came, was heavy with finality. "This is not about victory. It is about accountability. No one, not even those who sit in this chamber, is above the Constitution." The gavel struck again, but the sound was drowned by the thunder of voices. Some cheered wildly, waving flags in the gallery. Others shouted in outrage, fists raised in protest. The chamber had become a battlefield of words, split by loyalty and disbelief. Outside, crowds gathered as news broke across every network. Headlines flashed. Omar arrested in treason probe. Commentators shouted over one another, the nation's divisions laid bare in real time. In living rooms across America, families sat in stunned silence, children asking questions their parents struggled to answer. At dinner tables, arguments ignited. In bars, strangers debated heatedly over the footage replaying on televisions above them. And in the political arena, the shockwaves spread instantly. Cruz's name surged across polls, his approval ratings spiking overnight. Calls rang out for broader investigations, not just into Omar, but into others whose records might hide similar shadows. The story had already become larger than one woman. It was about the system itself, about whether the nation could trust those who swore to serve it. Back inside the chamber, the officers led Omar away. The heavy doors shut behind her, their echo ringing like the closing of a chapter in history. Cruz gathered his folders, stacked them neatly, and stood. His final words, spoken into the microphone, were simple but searing. "Let this be a reminder to every official who takes the oath of office. Betrayal has a cost, and the American people will demand it be paid." The chamber sat in stunned silence. The hearing was over, but the reckoning had only just begun.